Hello and welcome. This is Cheryl. Thank you so much for stopping by. In this video, I'm going to share with you how I created these two cards here using color sprays to create a very simple and quick underwater background. Now, by saying quick, creating the background was very quick. Letting it dry took a while. So I'm going to use this new Ciao Bella stamp set that I just recently got. And the one thing that I like to do when I open any stamp set that I get is I take a white eraser and I use that on the stamping surface of the stamp. Often when these stamps are made, there's a binding or there's a release agent put in a mold that helps the stamp to release, and that can interfere with stamping. So the very first thing I do, if I use any stamp in one set, I do the entire set so I know that it's done. After I've used the white eraser, I use a brush to brush off all the little eraser bits so that I don't have that interfering with my stamped image either. So I'm taking my stamp off, and I'm doing this on watercolor paper because I'll be using some color sprays to do the background and using a lot of water. You want to use a paper that can handle that moisture. So watercolor paper often will have a textured side on one side, but the other side will be fairly flat. I'm using the flat side to do my stamping and embossing on because I don't want the texture of the paper to interfere with my stamped image, as well as the fact that when I go to use the moisture in the colored sprays, I don't want to get moisture sitting in those little dimples that the paper often has. I want it to be on a flat surface. So I'm using an embossing tool to go over all my paper to remove any static. If there is any fingerprints, that will eliminate that. So that means that the embossing powder will not stick to those areas of the paper. I'm taking an embossing pad and I'm stamping my image twice just to make sure that I get a very, very good image. I like to do this in a stamp positioner. This time I'm using a Misty that I just got for Christmas. And the reason I like to use a stamp positioner is then if you happen to notice when you're stamping that you don't get a clear image, you can easily stamp over it the second time and get it perfectly in exactly the same spot. It just makes it a little bit easier. So I couldn't decide if I wanted to do this card with white embossing or with black embossing. So I decided to actually do both, and then you can tell me in the comments at the end which one you prefer. I truly can't decide which one I like better. There's things I like about each one of them. Before taking your embossing tool to emboss an image, if you happen to have any embossing powder sticking to areas of the cardstock that you don't want it to, take a soft brush and brush that off. If you go and use the heat tool on it and the embossing powder melts in a place you don't want it to, there's no way to remove it afterwards. So super easy to do it ahead of time. Then you're going to take your embossing tool and you're going to emboss your whole image. It's really easy to see what part is embossed and what part is not, because when the embossing powder is not embossed, it's kind of granular and dull. Once it's embossed, it goes glossy and flat. So I've got my black one completely done, and I'm going to repeat the same process for the white embossing powder. I do have this second one sped up because the process is exactly the same. The only difference is using white powder instead of black powder. And this one, obviously, because we're using it on white paper, you're not going to be able to see it quite as well. But once again, exactly the same process. I used my embossing tool to get any static off the paper, emboss or stamped my image twice, and now I'm putting the powder on the paper and using my embossing tool to heat it up. So I've got my two images done. I'm putting down a different mat to do my sprays. I want to be able to clean them up very, very easily. So I'm using regular distress spray on this. Any colored spray would work. I like the distress sprays because they are water reactive, and later on in the card you'll see I'll splatter some water droplets on there to get a little bit more texture into my background, and these distress sprays work really, really well for that. I'm not using any oxide sprays because I want the transparency of the distress sprays. The oxide sprays have a little bit of opacity to them, and because this is supposed to be water, I wanted it to be a little bit more transparent. Now, a little hint if you're using paper with water, spray the backside of your paper plus your surface. It kind of sucks the paper down onto your surface, and it helps the paper not to curl as much when it's drying. Now, that's the pro of using this method. The con is it does take a lot longer for that paper to dry because you've wet the back of it as well. And because it's suctioned to the mat that I'm using, air doesn't get in there to dry it. So it probably takes 3 or 4 times longer than it would if I just sprayed the front. However, because that spray isn't curving the paper, I'm not having my ink sprays bleed and move where I don't want them to. I can control a little bit more where the spray goes. And I really like how it turns out after just spraying it and then spraying the water over top of it. So I'm really happy to not have it move and run where I don't want it to. Now there are instances where you may want your colored sprays to run into each other, to run up, say, to the top of the paper. But for this effect that I'm trying to go for, this is how I combat paper curling. So now this is after probably about an hour. I still got quite a bit of moisture on that paper. And like I said, it's because the air is only drying it from the top. I actually end up having to wait till the next morning to continue working on my card. So while I was waiting, I did emboss and watercolor a seahorse just so I could make sure that those were the colors that I was wanting to use. Now these watercolors here are made from chameleon mica powders. I created a video with them. I've used them several different times, and I'll put links in the description on different projects that I've used them on, as well as the video where I created these watercolors. The video itself is not super exciting because it was just me experimenting, seeing if it would work, how it would work. And I watercolor an entire image with these chameleon powders, and it's just too much. So for this project, I'm only using it for the seahorse, so it has a bit of a different texture, a different finish from the background, and it works out much better. But it is interesting to take a look at that video and see how these watercolors are created. And I just keep them in a palette so that I can reuse them over and over again. When I'm done using them, the water just completely dries, and I can just use them, save them for my next project. So I'm using a watercolor brush here, and what I like about this watercolor brush is the water is in the handle. So when I go to change colors, I just have to squeeze my water brush onto a piece of paper towel and rub it a couple times, and my brush is clean and it's easy to go to the next color. I tend to be a little bit of a klutz, so if I had a bottle of water or a cup of water on my surface, I likely would tip it over and ruin something. So this works perfect for me. While I'm waiting for my seahorse to completely dry, I'm going to take some Glossy Accents and just put it over the eye part, as well as some of the bubbles that this stamped image has. And what I like to do when I'm using Glossy Accents is I'll take a scrap of paper and I'll just squeeze a few drops out on there as well, similar in size to what I'm using on my project. And that way, if I'm a little bit impatient and I want to go back to working on my project, but I'm not sure if that Glossy Accents is dry, I can touch my scrap piece of paper and not risk ruining my project. Now, I realized after doing the Glossy Accents that I forgot to hit record when I watercolored the seaweed on this image. So I'm going back and just showing you how I did it. I have 3 different colors of the watercolor distress pencils. And I'm starting with my lightest color, and I'm coloring the entire image of the seaweed. And then I'm going back in with the medium color. And I'm not even cleaning my brush in between because these are 3 shades of green. I'm not going to ruin anything. And even if they were opposite colors, it's really, really easy to clean off. If you wanted to keep your pencils pristine or your colors pristine, just rub the watercolor brush onto some paper towel between the colors, and that will solve that problem there. But for this particular application, it's not necessary. So I go from light to dark. I will put the darker colors where the seaweed goes behind something, for instance, for where it goes behind the seahorse, where the seaweed is twisted, that is where a shadow would be, or if a piece goes behind another, that's where another shadow would be. So you'd see a color difference there. Once I have that seaweed completely watercolored, I let it completely dry before moving on to the next step. Now I chose to do watercolor pencils to color in the seaweed here. And the reason I chose them is because it has a little bit of a different texture, different finish from the water or the distress sprays that I used on my background. The pencils have a little bit of opacity to them, and the paint is a little bit thicker, especially if you don't use as much water and you're using more paint from the pencils. And I wanted that to be able to show up against the blue background and not just kind of blend or meld into the background. If you watercolored your background, you could just watercolor your seaweed with this similar medium that you use for your background, but I wanted to make sure that it showed up, so I chose to use the distress pencils for that. I also just left my seaweed when it was dry as is, but you could take some glossy accents and put glossy accents over top of that just to give it a bit of a different finish from the Seahorse. Again, I chose not to do that, but it is an option if you wanted to give it a little bit of a different texture or make it pop out a little bit more. Once my seaweed was dry, I took some water from my distress sprayer, put it in my hand, and I splattered it all over the background. I tried to avoid the center area of the card, but I wasn't too worried if some of it happened to go onto that area. I just wanted a little bit more water bubble texture in that background, and that's what this resulted in. So I let that water sit on the paper for probably a couple minutes, and then I took some clean paper towel and lifted it up. If you want the effect to be a little bit more subtle, you can just leave that water, those water drops on there to dry. By lifting it up, I'm removing some of that color so you see that texture a little bit more. And that's what it looks like once it's completely dry. So now I can take my pieces because they're finished, and I'm going to cut them down to go to on the front of a 4 1/4 by 5 1/2 inch card. And I'm going to cut them to 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches. This first piece here is actually already 5 1/4 tall, so I don't actually need to cut anything from the height, but I do want to see a little bit of a mat around the edges from my card base just to frame the piece a little bit more. I like the look of that mat around it, but if you wanted, you could just put it right on the front of a card without having a mat around it. Once I'm done that, I'm cutting my card bases. These are an 8 1/2 by 11 sheet cut in half, and then folded or scored at 4 1/4 to create a card that is 4 1/4 by 5 1/2. I like to use a Teflon bone folder for this because it's just a little bit more durable, and I can really get the fold into my cards. Once I have those done, I put my piece on the front, and I just felt it was missing something. So I chose to get some foundry wax. I'm using the sterling here, and I'm just shaking it up really, really well. If you're new to foundry wax, the sterling one, the silver one, is quite a bit thicker than the other ones. So just know when you shake it, you don't hear the ball shaking quite as easily as you do with the other ones, but it is shaking in there. And when you squirt it out, it's also going to be a lot thicker in consistency from the other ones. It's made like that. It's intended to be like that. It's not a defect. I know a lot of people after they first came out thought there was something wrong with it because it was a different consistency. It's supposed to be like that. So I like to apply foundry wax with my fingers. So I'm just swirling it on my mat a little bit just to really coat my fingers and to get it to the consistency that I like. I like when I'm using this that it's not perfect. I like that it's got some areas that are a little bit thicker than others. It's a little bit more organic, and I think it suits this image of the card a little bit better than something that would be perfect and pristine. So I'm just putting it all along the edges. Now, if you've never used foundry wax, you apply it and then you use a heat tool to get that leafing to the surface. Foundry wax is a liquid leafing wax, but when you just apply it and you don't use a heat tool on it to raise that leafing, it's got kind of a matte finish to it, which isn't nearly as pretty as once it's completely done. I also wanted some foundry wax splatters over the back. So what I'm doing here is I'm taking some of that foundry wax, I'm adding some isopropyl alcohol to thin it out, and then I'm using my splatter brush to splatter it over the background. Now I'm trying to concentrate these splatters over the background. I may get the odd one on the Seahorse, but typically when you're using a splatter brush, it just goes right below where you're splattering, and it also has a really nice fine splatter, which is what I like. To clean up the foundry wax, I just spray with some isopropyl alcohol and then use a paper towel to clean my surface. It cleans very, very easily. And then I use the same method to clean my splatter brush. It will stain the ends, the tips of your splatter brush a little bit, but doesn't ruin anything. Once that is completely done and my foundry wax is dried, it only takes 10-15 seconds or so to dry. I'm using my embossing tool. This is the exact same tool that I use to emboss embossing powder, and I'm just running it over that to bring that leafing to the surface. It happens a lot quicker than embossing, And you can see exactly once it's done, it just turns shiny. It's kind of mesmerizing to watch, actually. And I find that this really finished off the image a little bit better, and it just made it pop a little bit more from the card base. And it really just adds an extra element, an extra different texture to it that totally finishes it off. So I'm using some Distress Collage medium to glue my image piece to the base of my card. I like using the Distress Collage medium because if any happens to squeeze out from the edges, it dries matte and it dries clear, and you're never going to see that there was glue there. The one thing that I do typically like to do if I'm gluing something to the front of the card is I like to use a large acrylic block to hold it down and leave it flat while I'm working on something else. You could take the time to just hold it in place, but because the watercolor paper is a little bit warped from the moisture, I find this works really, really well and frees my hands up to work on other things. So I'm going to put an acrylic block on this piece as well. If you find your acrylic block isn't heavy enough and you want it to give it a little bit more weight, you can just use a glass jar with some glass beads in it or something else. I'm also using a jar that has just my pens and stuff like that for my desk here. And this is the finished result. All of the supplies I'm using, as well as those other videos that I use, the chameleon powders, will be linked in the description down below. Thank you so much for watching. Please hit the subscribe button before you leave, and have a great day.